Chapter 144. In Touch with Labor. Whilst I was yet winding up my work on the committee, I received a letter from SJTS Mohanlal, Pandya and Shankarlal Parikh telling me of the failure of crops in the Kheda district, and asking me to guide the peasants, who were unable to pay the assessment. I had not the inclination, the ability or the courage to advise without an inquiry on the spot. At the same time there came a letter from Srimati Anaswayabai about the condition of labor in Ahmedabad. Wages were low, the laborers had long been agitating for an increment, and I had a desire to guide them if I could. But I had not the confidence to direct even this comparatively small affair from that long distance. So I seized the first opportunity to go to Ahmedabad. I had hoped that I should be able to finish both these matters quickly and get back to Champaran to supervise the constructive work that had been inaugurated there. But things did not move as swiftly as I had wished, and I was unable to return to Champaran, with the result that the schools closed down one by one. My co-workers and I had built many castles in the air, but they all vanished for the time being. One of these was cow protection work in Champaran, besides rural sanitation and education. I had seen, in the course of my travels, that cow provocation and Hindi propaganda had become the exclusive concern of the Marwadis. A Marwadi friend had sheltered me in his #Dharmashala hashtag, whilst at Betia. Other Marwadis of the place had interested me in their #Gaushala hashtag, dairy. My ideas about cow protection had been definitely formed then, and my conception of the work was the same as it is today. Cow protection, in my opinion, included cattle breeding, improvement of the stock, humane treatment of bullocks, formation of model dairies, etc. The Marwadi friends had promised full cooperation in this work, but as I could not fix myself up in Champaran, the scheme could not be carried out. The #Gaushala hashtag in Betia is still there, but it was not become a model dairy. The Champaran Gulak is still made to work beyond his capacity, and the so-called Hindu still cruelly belabors the poor animal and disgraces his religion. That this work should have remained unrealized has been, to me, a continual regret, and whenever I go to Champaran and hear the gentle reproaches of the Marwadi and Bihari friends, I recall with a heavy sigh all those plans which I had to drop so abruptly. The educational work in one way or another is going on in many places. But the cow protection work had not taken firm root, and has not, therefore, progressed in the direction intended. Whilst the Kheda peasants' question was still being discussed, I had already taken up the question of the mill hands in Ahmedabad. I was in a most delicate situation. The mill hands case was strong. Srimati Anaswayabai had to battle against her own brother, SJT Umbalal Sarabai, who led the fray on behalf of the mill owners. My relations with them were friendly, and that made fighting with them the more difficult. I held consultations with them, and requested them to refer the dispute to arbitration. I had therefore to advise the laborers to go on strike. Before I did so, I came in very close contact with them and their leaders, and explained to them the conditions of a successful strike. 1. Never resort to violence. 2. Never to molest blacklegs. 3. Never to depend upon alms, and 4. To remain firm, no matter how long the strike continued, and to earn bread, during the strike, by any other honest labor. The leaders of the strike understood and accepted the conditions, and the laborers pledged themselves at a general meeting not to resume work until either their terms were accepted or the mill owners agreed to refer the dispute to arbitration. It was during this strike that I came to know intimately SJTS, Vallabhai Patel and Shankarlal. Banker. Srimati Anaswayabai I knew well before this. We had daily meetings of the strikers under the shade of a tree on the bank of the Sabarmati. They attended the meeting in their thousands, and I reminded them in my speeches of their pledge and of the duty to maintain peace and self-respect. They daily paraded the streets of the city in peaceful procession, carrying their banner bearing the inscription #Ektek keep the pledge. The strike went on for 21 days. During the continuance of the strike I consulted the mill owners from time to time and entreated them to do justice to the laborers. We have our pledge. 2, they used to say. Our relations with the laborers are those of parents and children. How can we brook the interference of a third party? Where is the room for arbitration? Chapter 145. A peep into the ashram. Before I proceed to describe the progress of the labor dispute, it is essential to have a peep into the ashram. All the while I was in Champaran the ashram was never out of my mind, and occasionally I paid it flying visits. At that time the ashram was in Kakrab, a small village near Ahmedabad. Plague broke out in this village, and I saw evident danger to the safety of the ashram children. It was impossible to keep ourselves immune from the effects of the surrounding insanitation, however scrupulously we might observe the rules of cleanliness within the ashram walls. We were not then equal either to getting the Kakrab people to observe these rules nor to serving the village otherwise. Our ideal was to have the ashram at a safe distance both from town and village, and yet at a manageable distance from either. And we were determined, some day, to settle on ground of our own. The plague, I felt, was sufficient notice to quit Kakrab. SJT, Punjab Bhai Hirachand, a merchant in Ahmedabad, had come in close contact with the ashram, and used to serve us in a number of matters in a pure and selfless spirit. He had a wide experience of things in Ahmedabad, and he volunteered to procure us suitable land. I went about with him north and south of Kakrab in search of land, and then suggested to him to find out a piece of land 3 or 4 miles to the north. He hit upon the present site. Its vicinity to the Sabarmati Central Jail was for me a special attraction. As jail going was understood to be the normal lot of satyagrahis, I liked this position. And I knew that the sites selected for jails have generally clean surroundings. In about 8 days the sale was executed. There was no building on the land and no tree. But its situation on the bank of the river and its solitude were great advantages. We decided to start by living under canvas, and having a tin shed for a kitchen, till permanent houses were built. The ashram had been slowly growing. We were now over 40 souls, men, women and children, having our meals at a common kitchen. The whole conception about the removal was mine, the execution was as usual left to Maganlal. Our difficulties, before we had permanent living accommodation, were great. The rains were impending, and provisions had to be got from the city 4 miles away. The ground, which had been a waste, was infested with snakes, and it was no small risk to live with little children under such conditions. The general rule was not to kill the snakes, though I confess none of us had shed the fear of these reptiles, nor have we even now. The rule of not killing venomous reptiles had been practiced for the most part at Phoenix, Tolstoy Farm and Sabarmati. At each of these places we had to settle on wastelands. We have had, however, no loss of life occasioned by snakebite. I see, with the eye of faith, in this circumstance, the hand of the God of mercy. Let no one cavil at this, saying that God can never be partial, and that he has no time to meddle with the humdrum affairs of men. I have no other language to express the fact of the matter, to describe this uniform experience of mine. Human language can but imperfectly describe God's ways. I am sensible of the fact that they are indescribable and inscrutable. But if mortal man will dare to describe them, he has no better medium than his own inarticulate speech. Even if it be a superstition to believe that complete immunity from harm for 25 years in spite of a fairly regular practice of non-killing is not a fortuitous accident but a grace of God, I should still hug that superstition. During the strike of the mill hands in Ahmedabad, the foundation of the ashram weaving shed was being laid. For the principal activity of the ashram was then weaving. Spinning had not so far been possible for us. Chapter 146. The Fast. For the first 2 weeks the mill hands exhibited great courage and self-restraint and daily held monster meetings. On these occasions I used to remind them of their pledge, and they would shout back to me the assurance that they would rather die than break their word. But at last they began to show signs of flagging. Just as physical weakness in men manifests itself in irascibility, their attitude towards the blacklegs became more and more menacing as the strike seemed to weaken, and I began to fear an outbreak of rowdyism on their part. The attendance at their daily meetings also began to dwindle by degrees, and despondency and despair were writ large on the faces of those who did attend. Finally the information was brought to me that the strikers had begun to totter. I felt deeply troubled and set to thinking furiously as to what my duty was in the circumstances. I had had experience of a gigantic strike in South Africa, but the situation that confronted me here was different. The mill hands had taken the pledge at me suggestion. They had repeated it before me day after day, and the very idea that they might now go back upon it was to me inconceivable. Was it pride or was it my love for the laborers and my passionate regard for truth that was at the back of this feeling? Who can say? One morning it was at a mill hands meeting while I was still groping and unable to see my way. Clearly, the light came to me. Unbidden and all by themselves the words came to my lips, unless the strikers rally, I declared to the meeting, and continue the strike till a settlement is reached, or till they leave the mills altogether, I will not touch any food. The laborers were thunderstruck. Tears began to course down Anasuyaben's cheeks. The laborers broke out, "Not you, but we shall fast. It would be monstrous if you were to fast. Please Forgive us for our lapse, we will now remain faithful to our pledge to the end. There is no need for you to fast, I replied. It would be enough if you could remain true to your pledge. As you know, we are without funds, and we do not want to continue our strike by living on public charity. You should therefore try to eke out a bare existence by some kind of labor, so that you may be able to remain unconcerned, no matter how long the strike may continue. As for my fast, it will be broken only after the strike is settled. In the meantime, Vallabhai was trying to find some employment for the strikers under the municipality, but there was not much hope of success there. Mahatma Gandhi suggested that, as we needed sand for filling the foundation of our weaving school in the ashram, a number of them might be employed for that purpose. The laborers welcomed the proposal. Anasuyaben led the way with a basket on her head, and soon an endless stream of laborers carrying baskets of sand on their heads could be seen issuing out of the hollow of the riverbed. It was a sight worth seeing. The laborers felt themselves infused with a new strength, and it became difficult to cope with the task of paying out wages to them. My fast was not free from a grave defect. For as I have already mentioned in a previous chapter, I enjoyed very close and cordial relations with the mill owners, and my fast could not but affect their decision. As a satyagrahi, I knew that I might not fast against them, but ought to leave them free to be influenced by the mill hands' strike alone. My fast was undertaken not on account of lapse of which, as their representative, I felt I had a share. With the mill owners, I could only plead. To fast against them would amount to coercion. Yet in spite of my knowledge that my fast was bound to put pressure upon them, as in fact it did, I felt I could not help it. The duty to undertake it seemed to me to be clear. I tried to set the mill owners at ease. There is not the slightest necessity for you to withdraw from your position, I said to them. But they received my words coldly and even flung keen, delicate bits of sarcasm at me, as indeed they had a perfect right to do. The principal man at the back of the mill owners' unbending attitude towards the strike was Chef Umbalal. His resolute will and transparent sincerity were wonderful and captured my heart. It was a pleasure to be pitched against him. The strain produced by my fast upon the opposition, of which he was the head, cut me, therefore, to the quick. And then, Sarladevi, his wife, was attached to me with the affection of a blood sister, and I could not bear to see her anguish on account of my action. Anasuyaben and a number of other friends and laborers shared the fast with me on the first day. But after some difficulty I was able to dissuade them from continuing it further. The net result of it was that an atmosphere of goodwill was created all round. The hearts of the mill owners were touched, and they set about discovering some means for a settlement. Anasuyaben's house became the venue of their discussions. Sjt Anandshankar Dhruva intervened and was in the end appointed arbitrator, and the strike was called off after I had fasted only for 3 days. The mill owners commemorated the event by distributing sweets among the laborers, and thus a settlement was reached after 21 days of strike. At the meeting held to celebrate the settlement, both the mill owners and the commissioner were present. The advice which the latter gave to the mill hands on this occasion was, "You should always act as Mr. Gandhi advises you." Almost immediately after these events I had to engage in a tussle with this very gentleman. But circumstances were changed, and he had changed with the circumstances. He then set about warning the Patitas of Kedah against following my advice. I must not close this chapter without noting here an incident, as amusing as it was pathetic. It happened in connection with the distribution of sweets. The mill owners had ordered a very large quantity, and it was a problem how to distribute it among the thousands of laborers. It was decided that it would be the fittest thing to distribute it in the open, beneath the very tree under which the pledge had been taken, especially as it would have been extremely inconvenient to assemble them all together in any other place. I had taken it for granted that the men who had observed strict discipline for full 21 days would, without any difficulty, be able to remain standing in an orderly manner while the sweets were being distributed, and not make an impatient scramble for them. But when it came to the test, all the methods that were tried for making the distribution failed. Again and again their ranks would break into confusion after distribution had proceeded for a couple of minutes. The leaders of the mill hands tried their best to restore order, but in vain. The confusion, the crush, and the scramble at last became so great that quite an amount of the sweets was spoiled by being trampled under foot, and the attempt to distribute them in the open had finally to be given up. With difficulty we succeeded in taking away the remaining sweets to Chef Umbalal's bungalow in Mirzapur. Sweets were distributed comfortably the next day within the compound of that bungalow. The comic side of this incident is obvious, but the pathetic side bears mention. Subsequent inquiry revealed the fact that the beggar population of Ahmedabad, having got scent of the fact that sweets were to be distributed under the #Ektek #tree, had gone there in large numbers, and it was their hungry scramble for the sweets that had created all the confusion and disorder. The grinding poverty and starvation with which our country is afflicted is such that it drives more and more men every year into the ranks of the beggars, whose desperate struggle for bread renders them insensible to all feelings of decency and self-respect. And our philanthropists, instead of providing work for them and insisting on their working for bread, give them alms. Chapter 147. The Kheda Satyagraha. No breathing time was, however, in store for me. Hardly was the Ahmedabad mill hand strike over, when I had to plunge into the Kheda Satyagraha struggle. A condition approaching famine had arisen in the Kheda district owing to a widespread failure of crops, and the Patitas of Kheda were considering the question of getting the revenue assessment for the year suspended. SJT Amritlal Thakur had already inquired into and reported on the situation and personally discussed the question with the commissioner, before I gave definite advice to the cultivators. SJT's Mohanlal Pandya and Shankarlal Parikh had also thrown themselves into the fight, and had set up an agitation in the Bombay Legislative Council through SJT Vithalbhai Patel and the late Sir Gokuldas Kahandas Parekh. More than one deputation had waited upon the governor in that connection. I was at this president of the Gujarat Sabha. The Sabha sent petitions and telegrams to the government and even patiently swallowed the insults and threats of the commissioner. The conduct of the officials on this occasion was so ridiculous and undignified as to be almost incredible now. The cultivators' demand was as clear as daylight, and so moderate as to make out a strong case for its acceptance. Under the land revenue rules, if the crop was 4 annas or under, the cultivators could claim full suspension of the revenue assessment for the year. According to the official figures, the crop was said to be over 4 annas. The contention of the cultivators, on the other hand, was that it was less than 4 annas. But the government was in on mood to listen, and regarded the popular demand for arbitration as #lese majeste #. At last, all petitioning and prayer having failed, after taking counsel with co-workers, I advised the Patitas RO resort to Satyagraha. Besides the volunteers of Kheda, my principal comrades in this struggle were SJT's Vallabhai Patel, Shankarlal Bankar, Srimati Anasuyaben, SJT's Indalal Yajnik, Mahadev Desai and others. SJT Vallabhai, in joining the struggle, had to suspend a splendid and growing practice at the bar, which for all practical purposes he was never able to resume. We fixed up our headquarters at the Nadiad Anathashram, no other place being available which would have been large enough to accommodate all of us. The following pledge was signed by the Satyagrahis. Knowing that the crops of our villages are less than 4 annas, we requested the government to suspend the collection of revenue assessment till the ensuing year, but the government had not acceded to our prayer. Therefore, we, the undersigned, hereby solemnly declare that we shall not, of our own accord, pay to the government the full or the remaining revenue for the year. We shall let the government take whatever legal steps it may think fit and gladly suffer the consequences of our non-payment. We shall rather let our lands be forfeited than that by voluntary payment we should allow our case to be considered flace or should compromise our self-respect. Should the government, however, agree to suspend collection of the second installment of the assessment throughout the district, such amongst us as are in a position to pay will pay up the whole or the balance of the revenue that may be due. The reason why those who are able to pay still withhold payment is that, if they pay up, the poorer ryots may in a panic sell their chattels or incur debts to pay their dues, and thereby bring suffering upon themselves. In these circumstances we feel that, for the sake of the poor, it is the duty even of those who can afford to pay to withhold payment of their assessment. I cannot devote many chapters to this struggle, so a number of sweet recollections in this connection will have to be crowded out. Those who want to make a fuller and deeper study of this important fight would do well to read the full and authentic history of the Kheda Satyagraha by SJT Shankarlal Parikh of Kathlal, Kheda. Chapter 148. The Onion Thief. Champaran being in a faraway corner of India, and the press having been kept out of the campaign, it did not attract visitors from outside. Not so with the Kheda campaign, of which the happenings were reported in the press from day to day. The Gujaratis were deeply interested in the fight, which was to them a novel experiment. They were ready to pour forth their riches for the success of the cause. It was not easy for them to see that Satyagraha could not be conducted simply by means of money. Money is the thing that it least needs. In spite of my remonstrance, the Bombay merchants sent us more money than necessary, so that we had some balance left at the end of the campaign. At the same time, the Satyagrahi volunteers had to learn the new lesson of simplicity. I cannot say that they imbibed it fully, but they considerably changed their ways of life. For the Patita farmers, too, the fight was quite a new thing. We had, therefore, to go about from village to village explaining the principles of the Satyagraha. The main thing was to rid the agriculturists of their fear by making them realize that the officials were not the masters but the servants of the people, inasmuch as they received their salaries from the taxpayer. And then it seemed well nigh impossible to make them realize the duty of combining civility with fearlessness. Once they had shed the fear of the officials, how could they be stopped from returning their insults? And yet if they resorted to incivility, it would spoil their Satyagraha, like a drop of arsenic in milk. I realized later that they had less fully learnt the lesson of civility than I had expected. Experience has taught me that civility is the most difficult part of Satyagraha. Civility does not here mean the mere outward gentleness and desire to do the opponent good. These should show themselves in every act of a Satyagrahi. In the initial stages, though the people exhibited much courage, the government did not seem inclined to take strong action. But as the people's firmness showed no signs of wavering, the government began coercion. The attachment officers sold people's cattle and seized whatever movables they could lay hands on. Penalty notices were served, and in some cases standing crops were attached. This unnerved the peasants, some of whom paid up their dues, while others desired to place safe movables in the way of the officials so that they might attach them to realize the dues. On the other hand, some were prepared to fight to the bitter end. While these things were going on, one of SJT Shankarlal Parikh's tenants paid up the assessment in respect of his land. This created a sensation. SJT Shankarlal Parikh immediately made amends for his tenant's mistake by giving away for charitable purposes the land for which the assessment had been paid. He thus saved his honor and set a good example to others. With a view to stealing the hearts of those who were frightened, I advised the people, under the leadership of SJT Mohanlal Pandya, to remove the crop of onion from a field which had been, in my opinion, wrongly attached. I did not regard this as civil disobedience, but even if it was, I suggested that this attachment of standing crops, though it might be in accordance with law, was morally wrong, and was nothing be in accordance with law, was morally wrong, and was nothing short of looting, and that therefore it was the people's duty to remove the onion in spite of the order of attachment. This was a good opportunity for the people to learn a lesson in courting fines or imprisonment, which was the necessary consequence of such disobedience. For SJT Mohanlal Pandya it was a thing after his heart. He did not like the campaign to end without someone undergoing suffering in the shape of imprisonment for something done consistently with the principles of Satyagraha. So he volunteered to remove the onion crop from the field, and in this, 7 or 8 friends joined him. It was impossible for the government to leave them free. The arrest of SJT Mohanlal and his companions added to the people's enthusiasm. When the fear of jail disappears, repression puts heart into the people. Crowds of them besieged the courthouse on the day of the hearing. Pandya and his companions were convicted and sentenced to a brief term of imprisonment. I was of opinion that the conviction was wrong, because the act of removing the onion crop could not come under the definition of theft in the penal code. But no appeal was filed, as the policy was to avoid the law courts. A procession escorted the convicts to jail, and on that day SJT Mohanlal Pandya earned from the people the honored title of Dungli Chor, onion thief, which he enjoys to this day. The conclusion of the Kheda Satyagraha I will leave to the next chapter. Chapter 149. End of Kheda Satyagraha. The campaign came to an unexpected end. It was clear that the people were exhausted, and I hesitated to let the unbending be driven to utter ruin. I was casting about for some graceful way of terminating the struggle which would be acceptable to a Satyagrahi. Such a one appeared quite unexpectedly. The Mamlatar of the Nadiad Talika sent me word that, if well-to-do Patitas paid up, the poorer ones would be granted suspension. I asked for a written undertaking to that effect, which was given. But as a Mamlatar could be responsible only for his Talika, I inquired of the collector, who alone could give an undertaking in respect of the whole district, whether the Mamlatar's undertaking was true for the whole district. He replied that orders declaring suspension in terms of the Mamlatar's letter had been already issued. I was not aware of it, but if it was a fact, the people's pledge had been fulfilled. The pledge, it will be remembered, had the same things for its object, and so we expressed ourselves satisfied with the orders. However, the end was far from making me feel happy, inasmuch as it lacked the grace with which the termination of every satyagraha campaign ought to be accompanied. The collector carried on, as though he had done nothing by way of a settlement. The poor were to be granted suspension, but hardly any got the benefit of it. It was the people's right to determine who was poor, but they could not exercise it. I was sad that they had not the strength to exercise the right. Although, therefore, the termination was celebrated as a triumph of satyagraha, I could not enthuse over it, as it lacked the essentials of a complete triumph. The end of a satyagraha campaign can be described as worthy only when it leaves the satyagrahis stronger and more spirited than they are in the beginning. The campaign was not, however, without its indirect results which we can see today and the benefit of which we are reaping. The Kheda Satyagraha marks the beginning of an awakening among the peasants of Gujarat, the beginning of their true political education. Dr. Besant's brilliant Home Rule agitation had certainly touched the peasants, but it was the Kheda campaign that compelled the educated public workers to establish contact with the actual life of the peasants. They learned to identify themselves with the latter. They found their proper sphere of work, their capacity for sacrifice increased. That Vallabhai found himself during this campaign was by itself no small achievement. We could realize its measure during the flood relief operations last year and the Bardoli Satyagraha this year. Public life in Gujarat became instinct. With a new energy and a new vigor, the Patida peasant came to an unforgettable consciousness of his strength. The lesson was indelibly imprinted on the public mind that the salvation of the people depends upon themselves, upon their capacity for suffering and sacrifice. Through the Kheda campaign, Satyagraha took firm root in the soil of Gujarat. Although, therefore, I found nothing to enthuse over in the termination of the Satyagraha, the Kheda peasants were jubilant, because they knew that what they had found the true and infallible method for a redress of their grievances. This knowledge was enough justification for their jubilation. Nevertheless, the Kheda peasants had not fully understood the inner meaning of Satyagraha, and they saw it to their cost, as we shall see in the chapters to follow. Chapter 150. Passion for Unity. The Kheda campaign was launched while the deadly war in Europe was still going on. Now a crisis had arrived, and the Viceroy had invited various leaders to a war conference in Delhi. I had also been urged to attend the conference. I have already referred to the cordial relations between Lord Chelmsford, the Viceroy, and myself. In response to the invitation, I went to Delhi. I had, however, objections to taking part in the conference, the principal one being the exclusion from it of leaders like the Ali brothers. They were then in jail. I had met them. Everyone had spoken highly of their much services and their courage. I had not then come in close touch with Hakim Saheb, but Principal Rudra and Dinabandhu Andrews had told me a deal in his praise. I had met Mr. Shuaib Qureshi and Mr. Khwaja at the Muslim League in Calcutta. I had also come in contact with Drs. Ansari and Abdur Rahman. I was seeking the friendship of good Musulmans, and was eager to understand the Musulman mind through contact with their purest and most patriotic representatives. I therefore never needed any pressure to go with them, wherever they took me, in order to get into intimate touch with them. I had realized early enough in South Africa that there was no genuine friendship between the Hindus and the Musulmans. I never missed a single opportunity to remove obstacles in the way of unity. It was not in my nature to placate anyone by adulation, or at the cost of self-respect. But my South African experiences had convinced me that it would be on the question of Hindu-Muslim unity that my ahimsa would be put to its severest test, and that the question presented the widest field for my experiments in ahimsa. The conviction is still there. Every moment of my life I realize that God is putting me on my trial. Having such strong convictions on the question, when I returned from South Africa, I prized the contact with the brothers. But before closer touch could be established, they were isolated. Maulana Muhammad Ali used to write long letters to me from Batul and Chindwata whenever his jailers allowed him to do so. I applied for permission to visit the brothers, but to no purpose. It was after the imprisonment of the Ali brothers that I was invited by Muslim friends to attend the session of the Muslim League at Calcutta. Being requested to speak, I addressed them on the duty of the Muslims to secure the brothers' release. A little while after this, I was taken by these friends to the Muslim college at Aligarh. There I invited the young men to be fakirs for the service of the motherland. Next, I opened correspondence with the government for the release of the brothers. In that connection, I studied the brothers' views and activities about the Khilafat. I had discussions with Musulman friends. I felt that, if I would become a true friend of the Muslims, I must render all possible help in securing the release of the brothers, and a just settlement of the Khilafat. Question. It was not for me to enter into the absolute merits of the question, provided there was nothing immoral in their demands. In matters of religion beliefs differ, and each one's is supreme for himself. If all had the same belief about all matters of religion, there would be only one religion. In the world, as time progressed, I found that the Muslim demand about the Khilafat was not only not against any ethical principle, but that the British Prime Minister had admitted the justice of the Muslim demand. I felt, therefore, bound to render what help I could in securing a due fulfillment of the Prime Minister's pledge. The pledge had been given in such clear terms that the examination of the Muslim demand on the merits was needed only to satisfy my own conscience. Friends and critics have criticized my attitude regarding the Khilafat question. In spite of the criticism, I feel that I have no reason to revise it or to regret my cooperation with the Muslims. I should adopt the same attitude, should a similar occasion arise. When, therefore, I went to Delhi, I had fully intended to submit the Muslim case to the Viceroy. The Khilafat question had not then assumed the shape it did subsequently. But on my reaching Delhi, another difficulty in the way of my attending the conference arose. Dinabandhu Andrews raised a question about the morality of my participation in the war conference. He told me of the controversy in the British press regarding secret treaties between England and Italy. How could I participate in the conference if England had entered into secret treaties with another European power? Asked Mr. Andrews. I knew nothing of the treaties. Dinabandhu Andrews' word was enough for me. I therefore addressed a letter to Lord Chelmsford, explaining my hesitation to take part in the conference. He invited me to discuss the question with him. I had a prolonged discussion with him and his private secretary, Mr. Maffei. As a result, I agreed to take part in the conference. This was in effect the Viceroy's argument: surely you do not believe that the Viceroy knows everything done by the British cabinet. I do not claim, no one claims, that the British government is infallible. But if you agree that the empire has been, on the whole, a power for good, if you believe that India has, on the whole, benefited by the British connection, would you not admit that it is the duty of every Indian citizen to help the empire in the hour of its need? I too have read what the British papers say about the secret treaties. I can assure you that I know nothing beyond what the papers say, and you know the canards that these papers frequently start. Can you, acting on a mere newspaper's report, refuse help to the empire at such a critical juncture? You may raise whatever moral issues you like and challenge us as much as you please after the conclusion of the war, not today. The argument was not new. It appealed to me as new because of the manner in which, and the hour at which, it was presented, and I agreed to attend the conference. As regards the Muslim demands, I was to address a letter to the Viceroy. Chapter 151. Recruiting Campaign. So I attended the conference. The Viceroy was very keen on my supporting the resolution about recruiting. I asked for permission to speak in Hindustani. The Viceroy acceded to my request, but suggested that I should speak also in English. I had no speech to make. I spoke but one sentence to this effect: with a full sense of my responsibility, I begged to support the resolution. Many congratulated me on my having spoken in Hindustani. That was, they said, the first instance within living memory of anyone having spoken in Hindustani at such a meeting. The congratulations and the discovery that I was the first to speak in Hindustani at a viceregal meeting hurt my national pride. I felt like shrinking into myself. What a tragedy that the language of the country should be taboo in meeting held in the country, for work relating to the country, and that a speech there in Hindustani by a stray individual like myself should be a matter for congratulation? Incidents like these are reminders of the low state to which we have been reduced. The one sentence that I uttered at the conference had for me considerable significance. It was impossible for me to forget either the conference or the resolution I supported. There was one undertaking that I had to fulfill while yet in Delhi. I had to write a letter to the Viceroy. This was no easy thing for me. I felt it my duty, both in the interests of the government and of the people, to explain therein how and why I attended the conference, and to state clearly what the people expected from government. In the letter, I expressed my regret for the exclusion from the conference of leaders like Lokmanya Tilak and the Ali brothers, and stated the people's minimum political demand as also the demands of the Muslims on account of the situation created by the war. I asked for permission to publish the letter, and the Viceroy gladly gave it. The letter had to be sent to Simla, where the Viceroy had gone immediately after the conference. The letter had for me considerable importance, and sending it by post would have meant delay. I Wanted to save time, and yet I was not inclined to send it by any messenger I came across. I wanted some pure man to carry it and hand it personally at the Viceregal Lodge. Dinabandhu, Andrews and Principal Rudra suggested the name of the good Reverend Ireland of the Cambridge Mission. He agreed to carry the letter if he might read it and if it appealed to him as good. I had no objection as the letter was by no means private. He read it, liked it, and expressed his willingness to carry out the mission. I offered him the second-class fare, but he declined it, saying he was accustomed to traveling intermediate. This he did though it was a night journey. His simplicity and his straight and plain-spoken manner captivated me. The letter thus delivered at the hands of a pure-minded man had, as I thought, the desired result. It eased my mind and cleared my way. The other part of my obligation consisted in raising recruits. Where could I make a beginning? Except in Kedah? And whom could I invite to be the first recruits except my own co-workers? So, as soon as I reached Nadiad, I had a conference with Vallabhai and other friends. Some of them could not easily take to the proposal. Those who liked the proposal had misgivings about its success. There was no love lost between the government and the classes to which I wanted to make my appeal. The bitter experience they had had of the government officials was still fresh in their memory, and yet they were in favor of starting work. As soon as I set about my task, my eyes were opened. My optimism received a rude shock. Whereas during the revenue campaign the people readily offered their carts free of charge, and 2 volunteers came forth when one was needed, it was difficult now to get a cart even on hire, to say nothing of volunteers. But we would not be dismayed. We decided to dispense with the use of carts and to do our journeys on foot. At this rate we had to trudge about 20 miles a day. If carts were not forthcoming, it was idle to expect people to feed us. It was hardly proper to ask for food. So it was decided that every volunteer must carry his food in his satchel. No bedding or sheet was necessary as it was summer. We had meetings wherever we went. People did attend, but hardly 1 or 2 would offer themselves as recruits. You are a votary of Ahimsa, how can you ask us to take up arms? What good has government done for India to deserve our cooperation? These and similar questions used to be put to us. However, our steady work began to tell. Quite a number of names were registered, and we hoped that we should be able to have a regular supple as soon as the first batch was sent. I had already begun to confer with the commissioner as to where the recruits were to be accommodated. The commissioners in every division were holding conferences on the Delhi model. One such was held in Gujarat. My co-workers and I were invited to it. We attended, but I felt there was even less place for me here than at Delhi. In this atmosphere of servile submission I felt ill at ease. I spoke somewhat at length. I could say nothing to please the officials, and had certainly 1 or 2 hard things to say. I used to issue leaflets asking people to enlist as recruits. One of the arguments I had used was distasteful to the commissioner. Among the many misdeeds of the British rule in India, history will look upon the act depriving a whole nation of arms as the blackest. If we want the Arms Act to be repealed, if we want to learn the use of arms, here is a golden opportunity. If the middle classes render voluntary help to government in the hour of its trial, distrust will disappear, and the ban on possessing arms will be withdrawn. The commissioner referred to this and said that he appreciated my presence in the conference in spite of the differences between us. And I had to justify my standpoint as courteously as I could. Here is the letter to the Viceroy referred to above. *** smaller font. As you are aware, after careful consideration, I felt constrained to convey to Your Excellency that I could not attend the conference for reasons stated in the letter of the 26th instant, April, but after the interview you were good enough to grant me, I persuaded myself to join it, if for no other cause, then certainly out of my great regard for yourself. One of my reasons for abstention, and perhaps the strongest, was that Lokmanya Tilak, Mrs. Besant and the Ali brothers, whom I regard as among the most powerful leaders or public opinion, were not invited to the conference. I still feel that it was a grave blunder not to have asked them, and I respectfully suggest that blunder might be possibly repaired if these leaders were invited to assist the government by giving it the benefit of their advice at the provincial conferences, which I understand are to follow. I venture to submit that no government can afford to disregard the leaders, who represent the large masses of the people as these do, even though they may hold views fundamentally different. At the same time it gives me pleasure to be able to say that the views of all parties were permitted to be freely expressed at the committees of the conference. For my part, I purposely refrained from stating my views at the committee at which I had the honor of serving, or at the conference itself. I felt that I could best serve the objects of the conference by simply tendering my support to the resolution submitted to it, and this I have done without any reservation. I hope to translate the spoken word into action as early as the government can see its way to accept my offer, which I am submitting simultaneously herewith in a separate letter. I recognize that in the hour of its danger we must give, as we have decided to give, ungrudging and unequivocal support to the empire of which we aspire in the near future to be partners in the same sense as the dominions overseas. But it is the simple truth that our response is due to the expectation that our goal will be reached all the more speedily. On that account, even as performance of duty automatically confers a corresponding right, people are entitled to believe that the imminent reforms alluded to in your speech will embody the main general principles of the Congress League scheme, and I am sure that it is this faith which has enabled many members of the conference to tender to the government their full-hearted cooperation. If I could make my countrymen retrace their steps, I would make them withdraw all the Congress resolutions, and not whisper home rule or responsible government during the pendency of the war. I would make India offer all her able-bodied sons as a sacrifice to the empire at its critical moment, and I know that India, by this very act, would become the most favored partner in the empire, and racial distinctions would become a thing of the past. But practically the whole of educated India has decided to take a less effective course, and it is no longer possible to say that educated India does not exercise any influence on the masses. I have been coming into most intimate touch with the riots ever since my return from South Africa to India, and I wish to assure you that the desire for home rule has widely penetrated them. I was present at the session that full responsible government should be granted to British India within a period to be fixed, definitely by a parliamentary statute. I admit that it is a bold step to take, but I feel sure that nothing less than a definite vision of home rule to be realized in the shortest possible time will satisfy the Indian people. I know that there are many in India who consider no sacrifices too great in order to achieve the end, and they are wakeful enough to realize that they must be equally prepared to sacrifice themselves for the empire in which they hope and desire to reach their final status. It follows then that we can but accelerate our journey to the goal by silently and simply devoting ourselves heart and soul to the work of delivering the empire from the threatening danger. It will be national suicide not to recognize this elementary truth. We must perceive that, if we serve to save the empire, we have in that very act secured home rule. Whilst, therefore, it is clear to me that we should give to the empire every available man for its defense, I fear that I cannot say the same thing about financial assistance. My intimate intercourse with the riots convinces me that India has already donated to the imperial exchequer beyond her capacity. I know that in making this statement I am voicing the opinion of the majority of my countrymen. The conference means for me, and I believe for many of us, a definite step in the consecration of our lives to the common cause, but ours is a peculiar position. We are today outside the partnership. Ours is a consecration based on hope of better future. I should be untrue to you and to my country if I did not clearly and unequivocally tell you what that hope is. I do not bargain for its fulfillment, but you should know that disappointment of hope means disillusion. There is one thing I may not omit. You have appealed to us to sink domestic differences. If the appeal involves the toleration of tyranny and wrongdoing on the part of officials, I am powerless to respond. I shall resist organized tyranny to the uttermost. The appeal must be to the officials that they do not ill-treat a single soul, and that they consult and respect an age-long tyranny I have shown the ultimate sovereignty of British justice. In Kedah, a population that was cursing the government now feels that it, and not the government, is the power when it is prepared to suffer for the truth it represents. It is, therefore, losing its bitterness and is saying to itself that the government must be a government for people, for it tolerates orderly and respectful disobedience where injustice is felt. Thus Champaran and Kedah affairs are my direct, definite, and special contribution to the war. Ask me to suspend my activities in that direction and you ask me to suspend my life. If I could popularize the use of soul force, which is but another name for love force, in place of brute force, I know that I could present you with an India that could defy the whole world to do its worst. In season and out of season, therefore, I shall discipline myself to express in my life this eternal law of suffering, and present it for acceptance to those who care. And if I take part in any other activity, the motive is to show the matchless superiority of that law. Lastly, I would like you to ask His Majesty's ministers to give definite assurance about Mohammedan states. I am sure you know that every Mohammedan is deeply interested in them. As a Hindu, I cannot be indifferent to their cause. Their sorrows must be our sorrows. In the most scrupulous regard for the rights of those states and for the Muslim sentiment as to their places of worship, and your just and timely treatment of India's claim to home rule lies the safety of the empire. I write this, because I love the English nation, and I wish to evoke in every Indian the loyalty of Englishmen. Chapter 152. Near Death's Door. I very nearly ruined my constitution during the recruiting campaign. In those days my food principally consisted of groundnut butter and lemons. I knew that it was possible to eat too much butter and injure one's health, and yet I allowed myself to do so. This gave me a slight attack of dysentery. I did not take serious notice of this, and went that evening to the ashram, as was my wont every now and then. I scarcely took any medicine in those days. I thought I should get well if I skipped a meal, and indeed I felt fairly free from trouble as I omitted the morning meal next day. I knew, however, that to be entirely free I must prolong my fast, and, if I ate anything at all, I should have nothing but fruit juices. There was some festival that day, and although I had told Casterby that I should have nothing for my midday meal, she tempted me and I succumbed. As I was under a vow of taking no milk or milk products, she had specially prepared for me a sweet wheaten porridge with oil added to it. Instead of #GHI#, she had reserved too a bowlful of #Mung for me. I was fond of these things, and I readily took them, hoping that without coming to grief I should eat just enough to please Casterby and to satisfy my palate. But the devil had been only waiting for an opportunity. Instead of eating very little, I had my fill of the meal. This was sufficient invitation to the angel of death. Within an hour the dysentery appeared in acute form. The same evening I had to go back to Nadiad. I walked with very great difficulty to the Sabarmati station, a distance of only 10 furlongs. Sjt Vallabhai, who joined me at Ahmedabad, saw that I was unwell, but I did not allow him to guess how unbearable the pain was. We reached Nadiad at about 10 o'clock. The Hindu Anathashram where we had our headquarters was only half a mile from the station, but it was as good as 10 for me. I somehow managed to reach the quarters, but the griping pain was steadily increasing. Instead of using the usual latrine, which was a long way off, I asked for a commode to be placed in the adjoining room. I was ashamed to have to ask for this, but there was no escape. Sjt Fulchand immediately procured a commode. All the friends surrounded me deeply concerned. They were all love and attention, but they could not relieve my pain, and my obstinacy added to their helplessness. I refused all medical aid. I would take no medicine, but preferred to suffer the penalty for my folly. So they looked on in helpless dismay. I must have had 30 to 40 motions in 24 hours. I fasted, not taking even fruit juices in the beginning. The appetite had all gone. I had thought all along that I had an iron frame, but I found that my body had now become a lump of clay. It had lost all power of resistance. Dr. Kanuga came and pleaded with me to take medicine. I declined. He offered to give me an injection. I declined that too. My ignorance about injections was in those days quite ridiculous. I believed that an injection must be some kind of serum. Later I discovered that the injection that the doctor suggested was a vegetable substance, but the discovery was too late to be of use. The motion still continued, leaving me completely exhausted. The exhaustion brought on a delirious fever. The friends got more nervous, and called in more doctors. But what could they do with a patient who would not listen to them? Sheth Umbalal with his good wife came down to Nadiad, conferred with my co-workers and removed me with the greatest care to his Mirzapur bungalow in Ahmedabad. It was impossible for anyone to receive more loving and selfless service than I had the privilege of having during this illness. But a sort of low fever persisted, wearing away my body from day to day. I felt that the illness was bound to be prolonged and possibly fatal. Surrounded as I was with all the love and attention that could be showered on me under Sheth Umbalal's roof, I began to get restless and urged him to remove me to the ashram. He had to yield to my importunity. Whilst I was thus tossing on the bed of pain in the ashram, Sjt Vallabhai brought the news that Germany had been completely defeated, and that the commissioner had sent word that recruiting was no longer necessary. The news that I had no longer to worry myself about recruiting came as a very great relief. I had now been trying hydropathy, which gave some relief, but it was a hard job to build up the body. The many medical advisors overwhelmed me with advice, but I could not persuade myself to take anything. 2 or 3 suggested meat broth as a way out of the milk vow, and cited authorities from Ayurveda in support of their advice. One of them strongly recommended eggs. But for all of them I had but one answer: no. For me, the question of diet was not one to be determined on the authority of the Shastras. It was one interwoven with my course of life, which is guided by principles no longer depending upon outside authority. I had no desire to live at the cost of them. How could I relinquish a principle in respect of myself, when I had enforced it relentlessly in respect of my wife, children, and friends? This protracted and first long illness in my life thus afforded me a unique opportunity to examine my principles and to test them. One night I gave myself up to despair. I felt that I was at death's door. I sent word to Anasuyaben. She ran down to the ashram. Vallabhai came up with Dr. Kanuga, who felt my pulse and said, "Your pulse is quite good. I see absolutely no danger. This is a nervous breakdown due to extreme weakness." But I was far from being reassured. I passed the night without sleep. The morning broke without death coming. But I could not get rid of the feeling that the end was near, and so I began to devote all my waking hours to listening to the Gita being read to me by the inmates of the ashram. I was incapable of reading. I was hardly inclined to talk. The slightest talk meant a strain on the brain. All interest in living had ceased, as I have never liked to live for the sake of living. It was such an agony to live on in that helpless state, doing nothing, receiving the service of friends and co-workers, and watching the body slowly wearing away. Whilst I lay thus ever expectant of death, Dr. Tolvalkar came one day with a strange creature. He hailed from Maharashtra. He was not known to fame, but the moment I saw him I found that he was a crank like myself. He had come to try his treatment on me. He had almost finished his course of studies in the Grant Medical College without taking the degree. Later I came to know that he was a member of the Brahmo Samaj. Sjt Kelkar, for that is his name, is a man of an independent and obstinate temperament. He swears by the ice treatment, which he wanted to try on me. We gave him the name of Ice Doctor. He is quite confident that he has discovered certain things which have escaped qualified doctors. It is a pity both for him and me that he has not been able to infect me with his faith in his system. I believe in his system up to a certain point, but I am afraid he has been hasty in arriving at certain conclusions. But whatever may be the merits of his discoveries, I allowed him to experiment on my body. I did not mind external treatment. The treatment consisted in the application of ice all over the body. Whilst I am unable to endorse his claim about the effect his treatment had on me, it certainly infused in me a new hope and a new energy, and the mind naturally reacted on the body. I began to have an appetite, and to have a gentle walk for 5 to 10 minutes. He now suggested a reform in my diet. Said he, "I assure you that you will have more energy and regain your strength quicker if you take raw eggs. Eggs are as harmless as milk. They certainly cannot come under the category of meat. And do you know that all eggs are not fertilized? There are sterilized eggs on the market." I was not, however, prepared to take even the sterilized eggs. But the improvement was enough to give me interest in public activities. Chapter 153. The Roulette Bills and My Dilemma. Friends and doctors assured me that I should recuperate quicker by a change to Mathurin, so I went there. But the water at Mathurin being very hard, it made my stay there extremely difficult. As a result of the attack of the dysentery that I had, my anal tract had become extremely tender. And owing to fissures, I felt an excruciating pain at the time of evacuation, so that the very idea of eating filled me with dread. Before the week was over, I had to flee from Mathurin. Shankarlal Banker now constituted himself the guardian of my health, and pressed me to consult Dr. Dalal. Dr. Dalal was called accordingly. His capacity for taking instantaneous decisions captured me. He said, "I cannot rebuild your body unless you take milk. If in addition you would take iron and arsenic injections, I would guarantee fully to renovate your constitution." "You can give me the injections," I replied, "but milk is a different question. I have a vow against it." "What exactly is the nature of your vow?" the doctor inquired. I told him the whole history and the reasons behind my vow, how, since I had come to know that the cow and the buffalo were subjected to the process of #fuka#, I had conceived a strong disgust for milk. Moreover, I had always held that milk is not the natural diet of man. I had, therefore, abjured its use altogether. Kasturbai was standing near my bed listening all the time to this conversation. We reached Nadiad at about 10 o'clock. The Hindu Anathashram where we had our headquarters was only half a mile from the station, but it was as good as 10 for me. I somehow managed to reach the quarters, but the griping pain was steadily increasing. Instead of using the usual latrine, which was a long way off, I asked for a commode to be placed in the adjoining room. I was ashamed to have to ask for this, but there was no escape. SJT Fulgent immediately procured a commode. All the friends surrounded me deeply concerned. They were all love and attention, but they could not relieve my pain. And my obstinacy added to their helplessness. I refused all medical aid. I would take no medicine, but preferred to suffer the penalty for my folly. So they looked on in helpless dismay. I must have had 30 to 40 motions in 24 hours. I fasted, not taking even fruit juices in the beginning. The appetite had all gone. I had thought all along that I had an iron frame, but I found that my body had now become a lump of clay. It had lost all power of resistance. Dr. Kanuga came and pleaded with me to take medicine. I declined. He offered to give me an injection. I declined that too. My ignorance about injections was in those days quite ridiculous. I believed that an injection must be some kind of serum. Later I discovered that the injection that the doctor suggested was a vegetable substance, but the discovery was too late to be of use. The motion still continued, leaving me completely exhausted. The exhaustion brought on a delirious fever. The friends got more nervous and called in more doctors. But what could they do with a patient who would not listen to them? Sheikh Umbalal with his good wife came down to Nadiad, conferred with my co-workers and removed me with the greatest care to his Mirzapur bungalow in Ahmedabad. It was impossible for anyone to receive more loving and selfless service than I had the privilege of having during this illness. But a sort of low fever persisted, wearing away my body from day to day. I felt that the illness was bound to be prolonged and possibly fatal. Surrounded as I was with all the love and attention that could be showered on me under Sheikh Umbalal's roof, I began to get restless and urged him to remove me to the ashram. He had to yield to my importunity. Whilst I was thus tossing on the bed of pain in the ashram, SJT Vallabhai brought the news that Germany had been completely defeated, and that the commissioner had sent word that recruiting was no longer necessary. The news that I had no longer to worry myself about recruiting came as a very great relief. I had now been trying hydropathy, which gave some relief, but it was a hard job to build up the body. The many medical advisors overwhelmed me with advice, but I could not persuade myself to take anything. 2 or 3 suggested meat broth as a way out of the milk vow, and cited authorities from Ayurveda in support of their advice. One of them strongly recommended eggs. But for all of them I had but one answer: no. For me the question of diet was not one to be determined on the authority of the Shastras. It was one interwoven with my course of life, which is guided by principles no longer depending upon outside authority. I had no desire to live at the cost of them. How could I relinquish a principle in respect of myself, when I had enforced it relentlessly in respect of my wife, children, and friends? This protracted and first long illness in my life thus afforded me a unique opportunity to examine my principles and to test them. One night I gave myself up to despair. I felt that I was at death's door. I sent word to Anasuyaben. She ran down to the ashram. Vallabhai came up with Dr. Kanuga, who felt my pulse and said, "Your pulse is quite good. I see absolutely no danger. This is a nervous breakdown due to extreme weakness." But I was far from being reassured. I passed the night without sleep. The morning broke without death coming. But I could not get rid of the feeling that the end was near, and so I began to devote all my waking hours to listening to the Gita being read to me by the inmates of the ashram. I was incapable of reading. I was hardly inclined to talk. The slightest talk meant a strain on the brain. All interest in living had ceased, as I have never liked to live for the sake of living. It was such an agony to live on in that helpless state, doing nothing, receiving the service of friends and co-workers, and watching the body slowly wearing away. Whilst I lay thus ever expectant of death, Dr. Tolvalkar came one day with a strange creature. He hailed from Maharashtra. He was not known to fame, but the moment I saw him I found that he was a crank like myself. He had come to try his treatment on me. He had almost finished his course of studies in the Grant Medical College without taking the degree. Later I came to know that he was a member of the Brahmo Samaj. SJT Kelkar, for that is his name, is a man of an independent and obstinate temperament. He swears by the ice treatment, which he wanted to try on me. We gave him the name of Ice Doctor. He is quite confident that he has discovered certain things which have escaped qualified doctors. It is a pity both for him and me that he has not been able to infect me with his faith in his system. I believe in his system up to a certain point, but I am afraid he has been hasty in arriving at certain conclusions. But whatever may be the merits of his discoveries, I allowed him to experiment on my body. I did not mind external treatment. The treatment consisted in the application of ice all over the body. Whilst I am unable to endorse his claim about the effect his treatment had on me, it certainly infused in me a new hope and a new energy, and the mind naturally reacted on the body. I began to have an appetite, and to have a gentle walk for 5 to 10 minutes. He now suggested a reform in my diet. Said he, I assure you that you will have more energy and regain your strength quicker if you take raw eggs. Eggs are as harmless as milk. They certainly cannot come under the category of meat. And do you know that all eggs are not fertilized? There are sterilized eggs on the market. I was not, however, prepared to take even the sterilized eggs. But the improvement was enough to give me interest in public activities. Chapter 153. The Rollat Bills and My Dilemma. Friends and doctors assured me that I should recuperate quicker by a change to Mathrin, so I went there. But the water at Mathrin being very hard, it made my stay there extremely difficult. As a result of the attack of the dysentery that I had, my anal tract had become extremely tender. And owing to fissures, I felt an excruciating pain at the time of evacuation, so that the very idea of eating filled me with dread. Before the week was over, I had to flee from Mathrin. Shankar Lal, banker, now constituted himself the guardian of my health, and pressed me to consult Dr. Dalal. Dr. Dalal was called accordingly. His capacity for taking instantaneous decisions captured me. He said, I cannot rebuild your body unless you take milk. If in addition you would take iron and arsenic injections, I would guarantee fully to renovate your constitution. You can give me the injections, I replied, but milk is a different question. I have a vow against it. What exactly is the nature of your vow? The doctor inquired. I told him the whole history and the reasons behind my vow, how, since I had come to know that the cow and the buffalo were subjected to the process of #fuka#, I had conceived a strong disgust for milk. Moreover, I had always held that milk is not the natural diet of man. I had, therefore, abjured its use altogether. Castorby was standing near my bed listening all the time to this conversation. For any length of time I have ever felt at home in the South. Thanks to my South African work, I felt I had some sort of special right over the Tamils and Telugus, and the good people of the South have never belied my belief. The invitation had come over the signature of the late SJT Kasturi Ranga Iyengar. But the man behind the invitation, as I subsequently learned on my way to Madras, was Rajagopalachari. This might be said to be my first acquaintance with him. At any rate, this was the first time that we came to know each other personally. Rajagopalachari had then only recently left Salem to settle down for legal practice in Madras at the pressing invitation of friends like the late SJT Kasturi Ranga Iyengar, and that with a view to taking a more active part in public life. It was with him that we had put up in Madras. This discovery I made only after we had stayed with him for a couple of days. For, since the bungalow that we were staying in belonged to SJT Kasturi Ranga Iyengar, I was under the impression that we were his guests. Mahadev Desai, however, corrected me. He very soon formed a close acquaintance with Rajagopalachari, who, from his innate shyness, kept himself constantly in the background. But Mahadev put me on my guard. You should cultivate this man, he said to me one day. And so I did. We daily discussed together plans of the fight, but beyond the holding of public meetings I could not then think of any other program. I felt myself at a loss to discover how to offer civil disobedience against the Rollat Bill if it was finally passed into law. One could disobey it only if the government gave one the opportunity for it. Failing that, could we civilly disobey other laws? And if so, where was the line to be drawn? These and a host of similar questions formed the theme of these discussions of ours. SJT Kasturi Ranga Iyengar called together a small conference of leaders to thrash out the matter. Among those who took a conspicuous part in it was SJT Vijayaragavakari. He suggested that I should draw up a comprehensive manual of the science of satyagraha, embodying even minute details. I felt the task to be beyond my capacity, and I confessed as much to him. While these cogitations were still going on, news was received that the Rollat Bill had been published as an act. That night I fell asleep while thinking over the question. Towards the small hours of the morning I woke up somewhat earlier than usual. I was still in that twilight condition between sleep and consciousness when suddenly the idea broke upon me. It was as if in a dream. Early in the morning I related the whole story to Rajagopalachari. The idea came to me last night in a dream that we should call upon the country to observe a general hartal. Satyagraha is a process of self-purification, and ours is a sacred fight, and it seems to me to be in the fitness of things that it should be commenced with an act of self-purification. Let all the people of India, therefore, suspend their business on that day and observe. The day is one of fasting and prayer. The Musulmans may not fast for more than 1 day, so the duration of the fast should be 24 hours. It is very difficult to say whether all the provinces would respond to this appeal of ours or not, but I feel fairly sure of Bombay, Madras, Bihar and Sindh. I think we should have every reason to feel satisfied even if all these places observe the Hartal fittingly. Rajagopalachari was at once taken up with my suggestion. Other friends too welcomed it when it was communicated to them later. I drafted a brief appeal. The date of the Hartal was first fixed on the March 30th, 1919, but was subsequently changed to April 6th. The people thus had only a short notice of the Hartal. As the work had to be started at once, it was hardly possible to give longer notice. But who knows how it all came about? The whole of India from one end to the other, towns as well as villages, observed a complete Hartal on that day. It was a most wonderful spectacle.